you guys can turn to Psalm 62, another Psalm of David. There's no real background info for Psalm 62. It just says to the choir master according to Jeduthun, a Psalm of David. So we know that it was certainly intended to be sung to some type of tune or melody. But that's really about it. We don't know what story may be in the background of it. But as we read through this, I want you to note the repetition of a certain phrase in verses 1 and verse 5. It's going to begin each slide as we start through the first one, and the second one will begin with that same expression of, "For God alone my soul wait in silence." And that really clues us into the purpose of what David is saying here, and primarily that God alone is our source. He's the only one that we should be waiting for, the only one we should be hoping in, the only one we should be looking towards when we need help. So let's take a look at this in Psalm 62. He says, "For God alone my soul waits in silence." And notice here David is speaking about his soul, kind of in the third person, if you will. "For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be greatly shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to batter him? Like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. They take pleasure in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, but inwardly they curse. Selah." And here we see the repetition, but it changes from him talking about his soul to talking to himself. "For God alone, O my soul, wait in silence. For my hope is from him. He only is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken." And notice earlier he said, "I shall not be greatly shaken." Now he's come to a place of confidence and saying, "I shall not be shaken at all. On God rests my salvation and my glory. My mighty rock, my refuge is God. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your heart before him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. In the balances they go up. They are together lighter than a breath. Put no trust in extortion. Set no vain hopes on robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Once God has spoken. Twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his works." So God alone is our source. That's what this is about. "For God alone my soul wait in silence." Notice he also says to wait in silence. Not necessarily to wait with a lot of words, with a lot of anything going on, but just to be patient, to be still, and to trust in him. But there are a couple things that God alone is our source of that we see David mention here. First of all, God alone is our source of salvation. Okay? We see that in verses 1 and 2 where he says that from him comes my salvation. He alone is my rock and my salvation. He knows that God alone is his salvation. And for us, we would say, that this is true in an eternal sense. God is the only one who can save us from our sin and restore us to a right relationship with him. But that wasn't David's thought. David wasn't talking about eternal salvation here. He's talking about being attacked. People are after him again. They're trying to assault him and destroy him. And he knows that God's the only one who can save him from them. And God is also our salvation from any attacks of anyone or anything else. There are always going to be times in life that we get attacked for whatever reasons, whether it's friends, family members, coworkers, you name it. We're going to experience that, but nothing else is worth putting our hope in. God is the only one. I think of one of the other passages that says some trust in horses and some trust in chariots, but we trust in the Lord our God. Sure, even when Israel's kings went out to battle, they went out with their horses, they went out with their military, but they understood that these things are not what's actually going to save us. that it's going to take God to bring our deliverance. And so I'd encourage you, even if you're doing something externally that oftentimes is wise for us to do, to be diligent, we still have to make sure that we know that our hope is in God and God alone. Secondly, God alone is our source of security. Where we feel uncertain, where we feel like things may be shaken, who keeps us from falling and from collapsing in those things. And you see that in the second half of verse 2, he says, I shall not be greatly shaken. Again, David realizes he may be shaken some, but then as he gets to thinking about things and recognizing God's role in his salvation, he goes down to verse 6 and says, I will not be shaken. And you see some of the things that he talks about that in verse 3, people were attacking him to batter him like a leaning wall, a tottering fence. Imagine a wall that's already leaning and other people getting ready to push on it. Have you ever felt like that? You feel like things are just fragile, like things are right on the verge of falling apart, and people and circumstances and things are coming against you like you're a tottering wall, a leaning wall, a tottering fence. But even if you're that leaning wall and tottering fence, with God you will not be shaken. He will keep you secure from that. Now, again, we're not absolved of doing our own due diligence. We've got to be wise. We've got to do what he's gifted us the grace to do, the strength to do. But we can't put our trust in any kind of external sources for our security. We can't put our trust in money, in power. Notice here he says to not put your trust in extortion, to not put your trust in robbery. He says, when riches increase, don't put your heart in those things. Specifically, what did he say? If riches increase, set not your heart on them. Sometimes God blesses us with finances to meet certain needs, and we think, well, that's amazing, but we can't let it shift our heart to where our heart is looking to our finances to keep us secure. Because all sorts of people with lots of money have fallen and had a lot of issues. Nor can we think of that from power, from people in high positions, from connections we have, from networking we've made. We can't trust any of those things. We have to trust in God alone for our security. Thirdly, God alone is the source of our position. Look at verse 4. They only plan to thrust him down from his high position. And then we see it also in verse 9 and 10, he says, those of low estate are but a breath. Those of high estate are a delusion. They go up together. Put no trust in extortion or in robbery. He's talking about somebody in high position, somebody in low position. We don't know, but it seems most likely David would be concerned about people off the throne. That was his high position. People were trying to take him down from in verse 4. God puts you in the position that you're in, not man. No matter what role men played in that process of you getting into a certain position, or they may need to play in you achieving a different position, it's ultimately God who does it. We look at that. We talk about that often with rulers. We know that God appoints the rulers of the nations. Whether they're a king who ascended to the throne by birth, whether they're a president of a democracy who got there by a vote, whether they're a dictator who got there by force, we know that ultimately God is the one running the show and allowing or not allowing things to go on among the nations. So trust that God will put you in the position that he wants you to be in. And we shouldn't look to anyone or anything else for positional advancement or for anything to secure a position. To stay where we are, to get moving up the ladder, so to speak, it's for God to do. And when he's ready, he will, and no one can stop it. And if he doesn't want you to, you shouldn't want to, because nothing ends well when we move outside of God's desires for our life. So trust that God will put you in that position, because God alone is your source of position. And finally, we see in verses 11 and 12 that God alone is our source of reward. I love this. Because he kind of doubles down on it. He says, once God has spoken, twice I've heard this, that power belongs to God, and that to you, O Lord, belongs steadfast love. For you will render to a man according to his work. Power love, and reward are God's to give. And he gives them. And that fits in with the position thing, with the security thing. He gives the power, he gives the love, he gives the reward to those who are near him. And this verse here, where he says at the end that you will render to a man according to his work, may well be the basis of a lot of the New Testament comments we see towards that effect. Jesus talks about rewards. Paul talks about rewards. It's one of those things, and Paul specifically says a lot that it's based on our works. And this is right where we see it come from this inspired psalm from David. So even if others do not reward you, you can be sure that God will. And it's easy. I mean, our culture pushes a lot the need to be rewarded, to have our self-esteem built up, all of these things. But Scripture says to trust in God for our reward, to not put our hope in people. God alone is our source of reward. If all we're doing is looking for approval from other people, we're going to always be disappointed, and we're going to end up idolizing the people because we're longing for what they would say about us rather than being satisfied and content and at peace with what God says about us. So we can't look to other people for reward, whether it's monetary reward, promotion as an award, or just the affirmation of our efforts and our work. We can't look to other people for those things. We have to be content with God's rewards. And he says about it often, Jesus talked about that a lot, that no matter what people say and do here on earth, your Father will reward you for what's done in secret. And we need to trust him in that. So just as you meditate on Psalm 62 and read through it, just know that God alone is our source. He alone is our source of salvation, of security, of position, and of reward. And that should give us great hope and great joy and great contentment. Because in him, we will not be shaken.